These are our Unit 4 discussion board takeaways. That first question I asked you to respond to dealt with coming up with some coactive responses to counterterrorism. Y'all came up with some pretty good ideas too, but it all goes back to this idea that crime fighting methodologies can also work well for countering terrorism. I mean, the principles are pretty much the same. Co-opting the community into our overall crime fighting or terrorist fighting processes. And it goes back to our premise that terrorism, in addition to being a number of other things, is a criminal act. And crime fighting techniques at the local level can be very effective in countering terrorism on a large scale or on a small scale, either one. Getting it all down to the neighborhood level, I think, is the key to being successful long term. Y'all came up with all sorts of great ideas too. You said, well, we could have some community events, we could establish neighborhood substations, we could put together crime watch groups and train them and how to become terrorist watch groups. Some of you even talked about having some volunteer neighborhood patrols and also understanding there can be some drawbacks to that as well. So you have to screen and vet your people properly, but they're all good ideas and they've been used very effectively in fighting crime. I've used them myself over my career and I'm absolutely a huge advocate of them if they are done correctly. But what do all these things have in common? These things like the community events, the block parties, we used to call them character fairs, try to establish a theme. You try to get people out, you can, get some of your local grocery stores to donate the food. We used to love to get the firefighters to cook it. They're always good at cooking food. You cook some food and people are going to come. You have activities for the kids and people are going to come. So we would use local churches to provide maybe a jump castle or some face painting or some entertainment. They love doing these types of outreaches and it's a great way to bring the community together. I'll talk about one of our other techniques here in just a minute that we utilized. But what do all these things have in common? The community events, the neighborhood substations, the crime watch groups, the neighborhood patrols. It's all about bringing the police and the community together. It's these daily face-to-face contacts that are so essential to building trust. Instead of driving around in our patrol car with the windows up and the air conditioning and the country western cranked up, we actually get out of the car and begin to meet people face-to-face in a non-threatening, non-stressful environment. If you wait until there's a crisis, like if you wait until there's a Ferguson type event, it's too late to go about building the relationship then. You have to set the stage before the crisis. It's essential. And it's all about building trust through the power of these relationships that are built through daily face-to-face contacts. You don't build relationships long distance. You build them face-to-face, particularly these types of relationships. So trust is the fuel that drives these coactive efforts forward. It's essential. And I oftentimes in my police dynamics training, I will use a 3-part trust formula, which involves integrity, openness, and accountability, critical ingredient. And they must occur in that order, by the way. We tend to try to put accountability first. That's one of the reasons some of our coactive responses fail. That's why some of our crime watch groups fail. But the 4-step process is this. You must, first of all, establish your integrity in the eyes of the other person, in this case, the community. So you may be a man or a woman of integrity, and I think by and large, most police officers are, but they're not always perceived that way by the communities that we serve. So one of the first steps is establishing your integrity in the eyes of the other person. And then there's some strategic ways that you go about accomplishing that that's beyond the scope of this quick little video here. So that's number one. Secondly, openness. Open up these channels of communication for open and honest communication. And be prepared to weather the storm that's going to create. Because the more diverse the groups are, the stormier the seas will become when we try to enter into a relationship. And we have to be willing to push through to weather that storm. Again, there's some strategies toward accomplishing that, but the principle is sound. And then thirdly is the accountability portion. This is once the relationship, the foundation of the relationship has been established, now we begin to assign responsibilities and hold people accountable, because if you don't hold people accountable, these things will fall apart over the long term. They're not sustainable over the long term without that element of accountability. And the 4th step is problem-solving methodologies. Once the relationship's been established, once we have integrity in the eyes of the other, once we've opened up the channels of communication and dealt with some of the more difficult and challenging issues, once we've assigned responsibilities to the various people that are involved in the problem-solving process, now we can begin to identify the problem and come up with some solutions. That comes last, though. The relationship has to be established first. That's critical, because otherwise it won't withstand the stresses that we're about to put it under. So we're going to look in Unit 5 at some problem-solving methodologies and these are pretty typical. You can find these in business management. Some of you have probably been exposed to some of these problem-solving patterns through your own training and education, even here at CSU. But essentially, there's 5 steps involved in these types of problem-solving methodologies. 1, identify the problem. Make sure you're dealing with the problem and not a symptom of the problem. Secondly, brainstorm possible solutions, particularly if you're problem-solving with a group. Brainstorming in a non-judgmental way is a very essential ingredient. It gets the creative juices flowing. And once we get doing this course on campus, I'll take you through some of those problem-solving methodologies through some exercises. It should be a lot of fun. Third, out of the ones that you identify, you choose a solution. You hopefully get some degree of consensus about it. You implement it, and then you evaluate it. This creates a feedback loop. You go back and say, well, if we weren't successful, did we identify the problem correctly, or did we deal with the symptom? Did we brainstorm all the possible solutions? Did we choose the right solution? Did we implement it properly? Were there obstacles and roadblocks that came up that we failed to anticipate? And go through this evaluation process over and over again until we get it right. So that's the feedback loop that you use in these problem-solving methodologies. But you build the relationship first, and that's the key point of this whole thing. Because we want these groups, whether it's a crime watch group or a civic association or a terrorist watch group or whatever our community coactive relationships are, whatever we want to call it, they all have things in common. And they will not sustain themselves long term unless there's at least 2 ingredients. One is there must be a champion. So, and some of y'all mentioned that, I think, in your post. There's got to be a champion, a leader that runs with a flag, grabs a baton, whatever, and this is going to be a community member, because you want to deliver it over to them. You could help establish it, but once you've done that, you identify the champion, you turn it over to them. And then secondly, I already talked about, was accountability, because once we start assigning responsibilities, it goes something like this. Okay, you're responsible for getting the call list together of all the membership so we can call each other if there's a problem. You're responsible for finding us a place to meet at the next meeting. You're responsible for bringing the cookies. Whatever it is, you divide the labor there, and then you hold each other accountable. Because if you don't, life happens in the midst of all this. The kids got sick, the dog threw up on the carpet, car broke down, whatever, and people had the best of intentions, but they never followed through with accomplishing the objective. And if somebody's not on the phone saying, hey, how come you didn't bring the cookies? If you don't bring them next week or next month, you're off the cookie committee. We're going to get somebody else. There's got to be that level of accountability. Otherwise, they just tend to fall apart, sometimes in a very, very short period of time. Some of you mentioned the idea of having community substations. This is a great idea. I've used it myself very, very effectively, because it establishes a permanent presence in the neighborhood. It sends a message to any would-be criminals or would-be terrorists. I often use a 6-step plan for coactive partnerships within the community, and we came up with an acronym. Nobody ever takes you seriously if you don't have an acronym anymore. And the acronym was CRASH, C-R-A-S-H, and it stood for Community Response Against Strongholds. Could be one word, but we put it as 2 to make it rhyme or make it work into a word like crash. Crashing the gates of the stronghold. So we talked about criminal strongholds and the fear, apathy, and tolerance for crime that allows them to operate and to exist, and to oftentimes do so with a great deal of impunity. How do you break down that barrier? How do you crash through the walls of this stronghold? And they're not brick and mortar walls, of course. There's something much more difficult to break down, which is this mistrust, the fear, and the apathy, and the tolerance for crime. Well, first step is you prepare the army. You identify who are going to be your key soldiers, and you train them. That's part of what's going on right now. You're getting the tools that you need once you get out there in the real world to be part of this this army, so to speak. So it's like boot camp. So we prepare the army, we train them in these principles, we train them in the approach, we get them ready to go to battle. Secondly, we organize the resistance. These are the good people that still live in these neighborhoods. All right, these are the ones that you want to partner with. They may not trust you necessarily, but they're good people and they haven't yet given up on their neighborhood. I used to drive through some of these criminal strongholds, and you look for the one house that had the well-kept yard, or the one house that had the little rose garden. It was people that had not yet given up on the neighborhood, and those are the ones that I want to come to these community meetings. I want to educate them, I want to train them, I want to teach them how we're going to work together, and I want to fire them up, I want to encourage them, I want to motivate them to be part of this team that we're trying to build. So it's kind of like in the days of, say, World War II or something, where you had the resistance was the freedom fighters that were on the other side of the enemy lines, and you wanted to identify them and co-opt them into the process, and that's the good people in the neighborhoods. Thirdly, breach the wall. You got to find some entry point. You don't attack a fortified city at the strongest point, you try to find the weakest point. And I was always looking for some type of positive activity, positive program that was going on in the community. Could be a community-based program, could be a faith-based program, but something positive that was going there. Somebody that already made the inroads into the relationships within that community, already had built up some level of trust, and if I could get them on my side, and they could become the champions and the advocates of our efforts, then a large obstacle had already been overcome, and that is breaking through that initial mistrust barrier by partnering with people. Fourthly, purify the hood. These are your neighborhood cleanup efforts. By themselves, I don't think they do a lot of good, but if they're part of a more comprehensive strategy, they're critically important. It's about, the broken window type syndrome. We want to be sure that we clean up the graffiti and the litter and the broken down cars and the overgrown lots and that type of thing. And then this one, the fifth one, is parade the troops. And I guess I really don't know how effective this particular strategy has been long term, but it's a lot of fun to do. And what we do, we often partner it with that community event that we've talked about, whether it's a character fair or whatever. And we would, as part of that, establish a public safety parade. And I'd get every police car, everything with a blue light, every ambulance, every fire truck. I'd get a tow truck if I could. Anything that had a flashing light on it. And we would line them up, and after getting proper permission from the families, from the parents of the children, we would actually allow the children to ride in the parade. They would get in the police car. We didn't want them to watch the parade. We wanted them to be the parade. I remember there was this one parade that we did, and I was driving a big suburban vehicle, and I must have had 11 kids piled into that vehicle. I know I violated some rule somewhere. But at any rate, they were in the back of this vehicle. We were in this big parade with the blue lights flashing, and we started making our route around this neighborhood, which was a very, very bad criminal stronghold that we had. And those kids spontaneously, of their own volition, started singing at the top of their voices out of the windows as we were driving around that neighborhood. And guess what they were singing? Bad boys, what you gonna do? The theme song from Cops. And I thought this is a wonderful example of how we're going to start the process of building relationships with the next generation. But where I was going with all this, I didn't mean to get too sidetracked, but the sixth part of this six-step plan is to establish a permanent presence. These are your neighborhood substations that you referred to. And I always made it a point that I would actually rent a community substation. If I had an old house in a neighborhood or a storefront or some other facility that we could establish as our beachhead there, so to speak, I would do it. I would actually pay rent to have these substations in the neighborhoods. But I did have a limit to how much money I would pay. It was $1 a year. I'd only pay $1 a year, and that was just so that I legally had the right to access that property, and that allowed me to bring in inmates for labor to clean it up and get it in good working order. But this allowed us to establish these substations all over the county, and they weren't staffed 24/7. You got to make that very, very clear to the community. But you put a big sign up out front, Dorchester County Sheriff's Office, neighborhood substation, and that sign's there 24/7. If a patrol car is riding through a neighborhood from time to time, that is a temporary presence. What type of an impact do you think it's going to have? It's going to have a temporary impact. But a neighborhood substation that's there 24/7, that has a more permanent impact. And those are all great strategies. I'm glad you brought them up and you started this thinking process of how are we going to use these coactive principles to fight terrorism. That's really the point of the entire exercise. Now, the second question I gave you was about President Obama's recent remark about ISIS, or ISIL, I-S-I-L, not actually being Islamic. Now, I included this question deliberately because I knew it was going to be so provocative. And y'all grappled with it very well, I thought. Now, and there's no right or wrong answer to this. It was really looking for your opinion. But ISIS certainly considers itself to be Islamic. I mean, that's their whole goal, is to establish this Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, throughout the Levant and worldwide, ultimately. And I think our president was clearly trying to separate, these moderate, what we call moderate Muslims, which incidentally is a term that non-Muslims typically use, not the Muslims themselves, but be as it may, to separate the non-Muslims, the ones that aren't acting violently toward us or against each other, and separate them from some of these radical Islamist groups that clearly are terroristic in their approach and in their behavior. And I'm sure that's to try to keep them, the moderate Muslims, from being offended, keep them on our side, so to speak. Now, whether or not it was a good idea or not, that's debatable. Some of you took one side or the other. Some of you tried to hit it down the middle. I think it might be more significant to think about some of the comments that were made in referring to ISIS as ISIL. Now, you know the acronyms by now. ISIS is going by at least 3 different ones. ISIS is the first one we had, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Secondly, we had ISIL, Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, and then also just IS, which is the Islamic State. I think the terminology here is rather interesting when you understand what it means from their perspective, the idea of understanding the enemy. I mean, obviously they're operating in Iraq and Syria, but they're thinking beyond that. I mean, the Levant is traditionally and historically a huge area of land that includes most of what we refer to as the Middle East today, including Israel. That is a key factor. They see themselves as establishing an Islamic State in that entire region, including Israel. So I think we've got to be real careful about using that terminology so as not to, if we're worried about offending people, so as not to offend our Jewish brothers and sisters, particularly those that are Israelis actually in the nation of Israel. And certainly the IS, the Islamic State, well, that may be their goal, this worldwide caliphate as a goal, but they're a long way from accomplishing that, although clearly they see this as a critical part of that effort. So I like to use ISIS referring to this group. It seems to be more consistent since they are operating primarily in Iraq and Syria, plus it rhymes with crisis, so you can say the ISIS crisis. But at any rate, really what I wanted you to do, and as a result of this particular exercise in responding to this question, was to distinguish between radical Islamic religious beliefs and radical Islamic political ideologies. There is a difference, but they're all wrapped up in each other. And I think understanding this difference and unraveling this Gordian knot, so to speak, is critical to the strategies, us coming up with strategies either on a national, global, or local scale to fight the problem of terrorism. Radical Islam is a political ideology. First and foremost, it has political goals and is wrapped up in this extreme view of the Islamic religion. I think this issue of making this distinction is so important that I don't want to deal with it on this video. I want to do another video post, where we explore this in more detail and look at radical Islamic terrorism from the standpoint of a political ideology and what ramifications does that have for us as criminal justice practitioners. So stay tuned for that video coming up soon.